Hi, I'm Davy. I'm awesome. And welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling-related things, all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. So this week I'm going to be reviewing a documentary DVD that's been out for quite a while now. Something people from my age, my generation remember all too well, because we lived through it. The Rise and Fall of WCW. This DVD came out in 2009 and was directed by Kevin Dunn. This DVD goes all the way back to the beginning of Jim Crockett Sr. forming Jim Crockett Promotions, where yes, he was a part of the National Wrestling Alliance and promoted wrestling shows, but he promoted many things: boxing matches, strongman competitions, circuses. He was basically a carny promoter. Among them, he did promote a lot of wrestling. Until, of course, he passed away in the 70s, and the company, Jim Crockett Promotions, were taken over by his sons, Jim Crockett Jr. and David Crockett. Jim Crockett Jr., who sadly passed away last year in 2021. Rest in peace. But when they took over it, they basically just made it a wrestling company, promoting Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, being a part of the NWA, and eventually getting to the point that they were the top promotion in the NWA, and at the time the second top promotion in the country behind the WWF. One of the things that promoted them to that platform was the introduction of cable television. And of course, one of the biggest channels when cable TV first started was TBS, the Turner Broadcasting System, which at the time had wrestling on there, mostly Georgia Championship Wrestling, but eventually they got pushed out and Mid-Atlantic came along. Mainly because they had the top wrestlers that everybody wanted to see. Guys like Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, the Road Warriors. They got so big, they even promoted the very first big mega event, Starrcade. Of course, they talked about Black Saturday, an infamous moment in wrestling history, when Vince McMahon bought out the television show World Championship Wrestling, which wasn't a promotion yet, just featuring wrestling from Georgia Championship Wrestling or Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, whichever. But he decided to buy it out, make it for the WWF, but it didn't do that well. Now, there's a lot of theories to that. My personal theory is that TBS, even though it was a station that got all over the country, it was really more geared towards Southerners, and they didn't like the WWF at the time. They liked the NWA. So because of this, Jim Crockett Promotions eventually bought out Vince McMahon to get off the network and let them back on for $1 million, which Vince McMahon used to create WrestleMania. And then, of course, going into all the talent they had around that time, not just Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes and the Road Warriors, but Ric Flair's team, the Four Horsemen, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, and at the time, Barry Windham. Guys like Sting getting introduced, Ricky Steamboat coming in, and they even took a moment to focus on a guy who was on his way to being like the top star in the NWA, Magnum TA. He had the look, he had the charisma, he had the ability, and then he got into a very bad car accident that ended his wrestling career. But then the downfall of Jim Crockett Promotions was the fact that trying to compete with the WWF, Jim Crockett started spending way more money than they had coming in, which they had a lot of money coming in, so that must have been a huge amount that he was spending. So as Jim Crockett Promotions was going under, Ted Turner came in and wanted to buy them out and just turn them into WCW. The last holdout to selling that, though, was David Crockett, who really didn't want to do it until they had his mother talk to him. The power mothers have over us. But then it talked about all the management the WCW went through. But then it starts going into how things were getting good, people were making money, but then the mismanagement started happening. The first big mismanagement, Jim Herd. A guy who had worked for corporate Pizza Hut, now running WCW, who clearly knew nothing about wrestling, was not a wrestling fan, and was just coming up with the most awful ideas. Like the ding-dongs. But one thing they didn't mention, which I kind of feel they should have in this DVD, was his idea to remodel Ric Flair, who was easily the biggest star outside of the WWF. But they wanted him to cut his hair and start coming out looking like a Roman soldier and call him Spartacus. I am so glad that Ric Flair just opted to leave instead. That was when he went to WWF with the World Heavyweight Championship. And they only touched a little bit on Jim Herd, which I found a little bit disappointing. I get there was a lot to get through in this DVD, but personally, if you were a wrestling fan like me and have heard all the stories about Jim Herd, they could probably do an entire DVD on just how bad things were under Jim Herd's reign. But then when Jim Herd left, they brought in Ole Anderson, the guy who used to run Georgia Championship Wrestling before Vince McMahon bought it out and forced him out. And a lot of the wrestlers were excited about Ole Anderson coming in at the time until they realized that he was just a guy who wasn't changing with the times. And then they brought in Dusty Rhodes, and again, things were good for a minute, but Dusty Rhodes couldn't get really any of his good ideas out there because they kept getting shut down by the corporate suits who knew nothing about wrestling. And then Bill Watts. who they could probably do another DVD about his time in WCW. How he had some good ideas, but again was not really changing with the times. Plus, in my opinion, he was just too non-corporate to be a part of a corporate entity like WCW. But then, what led to the big glory days of WCW, when they brought in the Vice President Bill Shaw, who brought in as his head booker, Eric Bischoff. Mainly because after that time, WCW had decided that with Bill Watts having finally been gone, they did not want a wrestling guy in there, not realizing that Eric Bischoff's career had started in AWA as an announcer. However, when Eric Bischoff first came in, he had a few good ideas. Number one, my Graham tossed him the idea of Universal Studios wanted to do a wrestling show from there that they could film at and get paid to film over there all their weekly Saturday TV shows with a new audience coming in every hour. But instead they went to Walt Disney Studios. But either way, it was a good idea for them because at the time it helped keep production costs down. Instead of filming day to day from different places, they would literally film weeks worth of television just from that one studio. But also in a meeting with Ted Turner, where Ted Turner was asking how do we compete with Vince McMahon, said, you need to give me prime time. Which out of that came Monday Nitro, which was on around the same time as Monday Night Raw, an hour earlier but into Monday Night Raw, and started the Monday Night Wars. His next big thing was to get some of the guys that had made big names for themselves in WWF, guys like the Macho Man Randy Savage and of course, Hulk Hogan. And probably Eric Bischoff's biggest idea that he ever had, that like most big ideas in wrestling he stole from Japan, the NWO, which arguably has been one of the biggest, if not the biggest faction to ever come out of wrestling. And I will admit, even though I wasn't the biggest WCW guy back then, I was tuning in to see what was going on with the NWO. It was interesting. Had some of the guys I liked from WWF, like Hall and Nash, and later Six, who was the 1-2-3 Kid and went on to be X-Pac. That was the start of them getting away from the cartoonish, gimmicky stuff and getting into something that was a little bit more reality-based. But then, of course, another great Eric Bischoff idea, something that I was really tuning in for, the Cruiserweights. The guys like Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Rey Mysterio Jr., and on and on. Their matches were awesome. They were great. They kept me tuned in. Only problem is it did get a little boring watching the same guys fighting each other over and 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 over. Guys that we wanted to see get out of the Cruiserweight purgatory, but never did. And then something that started during Eric Bischoff's reign, but he admitted he didn't have that much to do with, Goldberg, who became their biggest star. And I remember that time being a wrestling fan during the Monday Night Wars, and that was like the big debate between WWF and WCW fans. Stone Cold Steve Austin or Goldberg. I wasn't a big fan of either at the time, though. Of course, because they were getting so big, bringing in the celebrities. At first, ones that made sense, like having a tag team match of Diamond Dallas Page and Karl Malone versus Hollywood Hogan and Rodman. That one made sense. You had two big athletic basketball guys versus two wrestlers. It worked. But then they started doing stuff that didn't work, like bringing in Jay Leno. But it wouldn't be the worst. We'll get to that in a little bit. Because at that point, this is when it started really going downhill. Like talking about just some of the bad decisions they were making. Like the hottest guy in their company, who was again rivaling the hottest guy in the WWF, Goldberg, and his first championship reign, they gave it away on free television. That just, to me, still boggles my mind that they would do that. Because they did get a huge crowd of 40,000 people after announcing the match literally 3 days before it happened. If they had announced the match for the next pay-per-view, imagine the buy rates they could have gotten. And then, of course, Goldberg being their big guy, he's got the big undefeated streak, to the point that obviously there was no real good way they were going to end that streak, but they still could have done better than him getting a cattle prod from Scott Hall and being pinned by Kevin Nash. Which I kind of give it to them that, okay, it was at that point that there was no way he was going to lose that streak without it being some kind of a screw job. However, to lose that streak and then the following night for Kevin Nash to just give the championship back to Hollywood Hogan after the finger poke of doom, again, just killed so much of that Goldberg momentum. Not only that, but another problem was all their talent that people were loving and wanting to see climb up the ladder were not being allowed to climb up the ladder, so they were starting to leave and go to WWF, where if they could climb that ladder, go for it. And then, in my opinion, the final nail in the coffin for WCW was when they brought in Vince Russo, who throughout the years has talked about people are wrong, Vince McMahon never censored him, Vince McMahon only grabbed his stuff that he would write and go, here's one little thing we can do to make it better, and that's all that ever happened. I'm sorry, but I'm going to call BS on that one. Especially because we saw what it was like for Vince Russo when he had full creative control, and oh good lord was it a train wreck. I mean, I get it, he was working with egos and people who had contracts where they had creative control, which was another stupid thing WCW did, but I sit here and rack my brain and I still can't think of one good thing Vince Russo did. Even the triple cage match that they had promoted in the movie Ready to Rumble, which I reviewed, they even found a way to mess up that match. And of course, one of the most infamous things that happened at WCW was David Arquette winning the championship. Again, a move that Vince Russo defends. Tony Schiavone's come out and said that that was actually his idea, but it still comes down to Vince because he's the one who okayed it. But he defends it by going like, oh, the next day we were in the front page of the New York Post. The whole thing of all publicity is good publicity is not always true. Because, yes, people tuned in. Yes, people wanted to see the train wreck. But then it made them go like, this sucks. I'm not watching anymore. I'm not putting the fault on David Arquette. They asked him to win the WCW championship. What fan is going to say no to that? But still, as a fan, it kind of made me feel a little insulted. At the infamous Bash at the Beach, where Jeff Jarrett laid down in front of Hogan. Basically them breaking the fourth wall again, which is not something we like to see in wrestling all that much, unless it really does go with a storyline, but in this case it didn't. But then, of course, to the final thing that finally killed WCW was the AOL Time Warner merger. As we know, Ted Turner had gotten basically forced out to where he still makes money off of Turner Broadcasting, but he doesn't really have much say in it anymore. And the people who came in and took over didn't want to own WCW anymore and did not want them on their networks. Now, a lot of people say that that was the only reason they failed, but I gotta say, as bad as decisions as those guys made around that time, not just for WCW, if WCW was the powerhouse that they had been a few years prior, there's no way they would have gotten rid of it. But at the time, it was hemorrhaging money. So, of course, they got rid of it. Which, of course, it went into how it got bought out by WWF, and then that was the end of it. Basically, WWF bought it for a very low price and has made tons of money off their videotape library. It didn't go all too in the whole WCW invasion thing that they did after WWF had bought it out, but still. As far as this DVD goes, it has been one of my favorite DVDs since it came out in 2009, just because it is a little nostalgic for me, being somebody who was around and a wrestling fan during the rise and fall of WCW. Now, personally, like I've talked about, I was always more of a WWF fan than I was a WCW fan, mainly because of WCW's up and down. It was getting good, and then it was getting terrible. It was getting good, and then it was getting terrible. It was getting good, and then it was getting terrible. It was very inconsistent. Even during their highest times. They brought out the NWO. It was very interesting. People were watching. But it started to get boring after a while when every single week it was just the same thing. During the big matches, the NWO would come out, beat everybody up, spray paint their backs, and that was it. I've talked about in other videos all my reasons I think WCW failed. I don't think there was ever one big reason. Like, people constantly talk about that, even the wrestlers. It was only because of the way they handled talent. It was only because they were spending too much money. It was only because of the AOL Time Warner merger. I don't think it was only anything. I think it was just a bunch of different chemicals being put into one beaker that finally exploded. A lot of people were very sad when WCW ended, especially because for a long time, I will admit, wrestling wasn't as interesting because now it was the WWE and they had no competition whatsoever. That was the only thing you had to watch if you were a wrestling fan, unless you had some access to some local independents. Now we have AEW out there who is building up and becoming competition for WWE, regardless of what people want to think. Plus, we got top independents coming out now, and not really competing, but giving you alternatives to watch. Not to mention New Japan Pro Wrestling is getting a huge following in the United States. Right now is a good time to be a wrestling fan, but after WCW went away for a long time, it wasn't as great. But even as somebody who wasn't the biggest WCW fan, I gotta admit, they had some good things going on. They changed the business in many good ways. They had their moment in the sun. Till it came all crashing down. So if you're like me, if you're a fan of nostalgia, then I definitely recommend The Rise and Fall of WCW DVD. If you weren't really around for that time, maybe you were just too little to remember WCW, but you're a wrestling fan now, then for the sake of learning wrestling history, I definitely recommend you check out The Rise and Fall of WCW. So there you have it. That's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit that little bell so you get notifications for when I post new videos, and leave a comment. Tell me what you thought of The Rise and Fall of WCW. Tell me if you missed WCW. Love you guys.